our modern idols are not quite as tangible as that. But now we worship success, or
Yeah.
we worship wealth. We worship prosperity. A higher growth in the gross domestic product. For our countries, and those are the kind of idols that we pursue now. In the political realm, we have liberals, for example, pursuing individual freedom, individual rights comes to be seen as the be all and the end all of everything. In socialism, it's the economic class that plays a kind of messianic role in bringing in the classless society, if we're using Marxian language in that respect. In nationalism, the nation, we make too much of the nation, and everything comes to be subservient to the nation in some fashion.
Well, welcome to another episode of Up Next. Today, I get a chance to talk with a new friend who I am just getting to know. And I'm reading his book, and I said, wow, this is some things that I've had to wrestle through, and no one's ever helped me to process through all these things. David Koyzis, I am so looking forward to talking with you today.
I'm looking forward to talking with you as well, Tommy.
Yeah, David, as you and I are talking, where's home for you? Where are you at right now?
Well, I live in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, and I've lived here for not quite 40 years. I spent a couple of years in Toronto in the late 1970s, but I actually was born just outside of Chicago and grew up there.
Yeah. And you and I were just talking about, I live on the south side of Chicago, right near Comiskey Park, White Sox Park. You're right over at Wheaton is where you grew up at.
Exactly, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. And then from that point on, you went over to Bethel College, which is now Bethel University. What did you think you were going to do and study back then?
I was actually going to study music. My last year in high school, the choices I had were between art and music because I was a real, an artistic type of a character. I grew up in a very musical family, and those were the things that I was really passionate about. I'm still an amateur musician. I've composed music. I have a number of projects of setting the psalms to verse so they can be sung to the proper Genevan melodies, and I'm trying to get that published at the present time. But there were two things that happened when I was a university undergraduate at Bethel, and they really moved me in the direction of studying politics. One of these was the Watergate scandal in the 1970s, when,
Yeah.
of course, Richard Nixon ended up
Hmm.
resigning as a consequence of that. The second thing that happened, this was in the summer of 1974, was that my father's native island of Cyprus, he grew up in the Greek Orthodox community in Cyprus. Cyprus was invaded by Turkey at that point, and all of my relatives, including my elderly grandparents, who were born towards the end of the 19th century, became refugees in their own country.
Ah.
And they lived in a city that's now Famagusta, in a neighborhood that's basically a ghost town now. The capital city of Nicosia in Cyprus is
Yeah.
the last divided capital in the world, after the Berlin was reunited back in 1989. And so those are the sorts of things that got me interested in politics. And as a Christian, I grew up in a Christian household, and very very serious about our faith. And I couldn't help but wonder, well, what does my faith have
Hmm.
to say about issues relating to justice?
Yeah.
So I decided to study political science, and I went on and got a master's degree and a PhD at the University of Notre Dame.
Yeah. And did you taught that for a number of years in the collegiate or high school setting?
No, in undergraduate, there's a Redeemer University College here in Hamilton. I taught there between 1987 and 2017.
Yeah, wow. David, if you look at this whole area, what was your favorite part? Was it during the Nixon era, or what was it during the 80s, the Cold War and all of that? What was your favorite part that you studied and loved to teach on?
Well, political ideologies, and that my first book, Political Visions and Illusions, is a study of political ideologies. And so, as I was observing the political arena, the political process, it struck me that people have blinders. They put on blinders, and they can't see beyond um, the view that their political ideologies will permit them to see. And so many people are talking past each other, in
Yeah.
parliamentary bodies, in the U.S. Congress and so forth. And it seems as though people have difficulty connecting with each other because they are seeing um, the political arena from different perspectives, but they're perspectives that will not enable them to connect with their um, apparent opponents.
Yeah. Now, David, has it? I know that it's always been the case with political ideologies and all that stuff. Has it gotten worse now with everyone just on their own side? There's no moderates. Social media algorithms in terms of what you're watching on YouTube, all of those things. Has it gotten worse, or is it still the same from what you remember back in the day?
Oh no, it has definitely gotten worse. I mean, I'm looking at this over the course of more than half a century now. And I think especially since the beginning of the 21st century,
Hmm.
things have polarized, especially in the United States. The very year that I left the country in 1987 to move to Canada was the year that the Federal Communications Commission abolished the old fairness doctrine, which had been put in place in the late 1940s to try to keep um, the conversation on a civil basis. So,
Oh,
growing up in the Chicago area,
yeah.
every so often on one of the television stations, there would be in between programs, they would say, well, on such and such a date, maybe WGN in Chicago or WBBM, aired this particular opinion on this particular issue. Now we provide time for rebuttal from a citizen who, and they would describe the person's qualifications and so forth, and then that person would provide a rebuttal, and that was mandated by the Fairness Doctrine.
Yeah.
Now, presumably, because of the First Amendment's guarantee of freedom of speech, the FCC decided to abolish that. And that's when you started getting people on the air that started to stoke the fires of anger on certain elements of the um, political opinion. And so the sorts of regulations that were in place throughout the time that I was growing up were abolished by the time I turned 32. And
Wow.
since that time, I think there's been a lot of anger.
Yeah.
You have people who are getting on the air and stoking a sense of crisis amongst Americans and getting them angry about things that may be worth looking into, but I think uh, a feeling of polarization that would not necessarily have had to come about if the old fairness doctrine had been left in place.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah. So, David, you taught for so many for so many years with undergrad students. What are you up to now? I know you're still dabbling in music. You're writing books. You're speaking. What are some of the projects you're working on right now?
Yeah, well, I'm since for the last 6 years, I've been affiliated with an organization called Global Scholars Canada. It's an explicitly Christian organization. It's been around since 1995. The model that they have is to send Christian academics to secular universities overseas.
Yeah.
So some people have been in Nigeria. There was a couple that were in Russia, just during the 1990s and at the very beginning of the Putin era. But at the time that I retired, I had no real interest in going elsewhere. I have a lot of readers in Brazil because my first book was translated into Portuguese
Ah,
in 2014, and then just a few years ago, the second edition was translated into Portuguese as well. I visited Brazil in late 2016, and the people there, they're just wonderful, marvelous people
mm-hmm.
there, and I just love them a lot, and I've made some good friends there. But basically, what I have been doing since becoming part of Global Scholars, it's I've pioneered a new model in which I've been engaging in research, writing, writing of books. My most recent one came out just a year ago. I assume that's the one that we're going to be talking about, Citizenship Without Illusions. And then I'm also mentoring a small number of young people as well. And the pandemic, strangely enough, contributed to my work because once you had the sorts of formats that we're talking on right now, the Zoom like formats, what is this called? Riverside.
Riverside, yeah.
Yeah, Riverside. That's right. And there are just multiple formats that none of us knew about prior to 5 years ago, 6 years ago now. And I think after the pandemic and the quarantines that were imposed, people from around the world um, started um, making requests for interviews, because now they said, "Oh, we can have Koyzis talk to us. We don't have to pay for him to fly him down here and billet him for however long and feed him. Now we can just have him come in for free and talk to us over an online format." So in many respects, my work took off around the time that the pandemic took hold.
Wow, wonderful,
Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah.
And David, a lot of times, talking to me about this new book, Citizenship Without Illusions: A Christian Guide to Political Engagement. Why
Yeah.
write this book now? What was your hope? Where you hearing about the book right now?
Yeah, yeah. Well, there are two things that precipitated the writing of this book. The first book that I wrote, Political Visions and Illusions, came out in a second edition in 2016. It was I'm sorry, 2019. The following year, Tim Keller endorsed it, and he did so several times over the next couple of years. I owe a lot to Keller, and I wish I had been able to meet him. And of course, he died. I guess it's just short of 3 years ago
Mm-hmm.
of pancreatic cancer, which I was real tragedy, because he was you know
Agreed.
a great Christian man, a great Christian leader, a humble person.
Yeah.
Um, and so that book came out, and people began reading that book, and they say, "Wow, this is quite something." But what do I do with all of this?
Mm-hmm.
How do I put this all into practice? Because my argument in my first book is that the various political ideologies that are contesting for supremacy in the political arena are manifestations of an ancient phenomenon that we know as idolatry.
Mm.
Idolatry, of course, takes something good out of God's creation, but it makes too much of it. It makes an idol out of that good that's within God's creation. And of course, that's what an idol is. We take something that God has created and try to replace God Himself with that created element. Of course, in the Old Testament, we read about concrete idols that were made out of wood, out of
Yeah.
stone, and so forth. We don't. Our modern idols are not quite as tangible as that. But now we worship success, or
Yeah.
we worship wealth. We worship prosperity. A higher growth in the gross domestic product for our countries, and those are the kind of idols that we pursue now. In the political realm, we have liberals, for example, pursuing individual freedom, individual rights comes to be seen as the be all and the end all of everything. In socialism, it's the economic class that plays a kind of messianic role in bringing in the classless society, if we're using Marxian language in that respect. In nationalism, the nation, we make too much of the nation, and everything comes to be subservient to the nation in some fashion. And so that's what I was writing about. But of course, when it comes to practical politics, how do you decide which parties to support?
Mm-hmm.
All of
Mm-hmm.
them are embedded. All of them are weighed down by these idolatrous ideologies, and so that's where this book comes in. A
Yeah.
few years ago, a good friend of mine who lives in North Carolina, and he was the former provost at a Baptist seminary, and he had me come down a few times to guest lecture there, and I was talking to him on the phone several years ago, and he said, "David, why don't you write a book about citizenship?" And I said, "Well, that's a good idea. Maybe I should do that." And so that's what I decided to do. I made a proposal to InterVarsity Press.
Yeah.
They're the publisher of my first book, and they accepted it. This was in the beginning of 2023. I actually wrote the proposal while our family was suffering through a bout of COVID, and I
Mm.
also had suffered a bout of frozen shoulders, and I was in quite a bit of pain as I was
Wow.
typing out this proposal to send to IVP, and so I signed the contract in January of 2023, and then my first two books, each of them took me 7 years to write.
Wow.
This
Okay.
one took me. This one took me only a few months.
Yeah.
So by
Yeah.
the end of 2023, I had a manuscript ready to send to the publisher. And so that's what where this book came in, and I wanted to try to address issues that people had asked me about who had read my first book. So how do we vote, for example? Now, I don't think that voting is the most important thing that we can do as citizens of our respective polities, but it is something that comes up, and people ask, well, how do I vote responsibly, given that the alternatives may be bad?
Yeah.
All the alternatives are bad in greater or lesser degrees. How do I responsibly cast a vote? And also, what happens when our loyalty to our respective nations comes into conflict with our ultimate loyalty to the kingdom of God? And so I devote a chapter to that as well.
Yeah, yeah. Or David, a lot of times one of the things I hear people say is, "Do I even engage in politics, or is this separate from the world? I shouldn't even
Right.
bother with it." What would you
That's
say to that person?
I would say that that's naive. We cannot separate ourselves from the world. We may think that we can separate ourselves from politics, but the issues that we deal with as Christians in the political realm are the same issues that we deal with in the marketplace, in the corporate world. In if even if we're entrepreneurs who are starting small businesses, if you will, we're going to have to deal with issues as to how do we relate to the larger world. And we cannot simply cordon ourselves off from politics and say, I am going to leave the various ideologies and political parties and the political realm uh, aside. I'm going to separate myself from them to try to make myself more pure. Well, that's not the way that life works in the world where God has placed us.
But the problem is, the more sometimes we engage in politics, we become cynical. Just like a lot of times, as I get
Oh yeah,
engaged more in ministry, I've
that's right.
grown cynical of the ministry world because I'm saying, "Oh my gosh, do people really act like this?" But you
Yeah, yeah,
describe this whole idea of disillusionment not as
yeah.
cynicism, but as a form of spiritual clarity. What does that mean?
Yeah, yeah. Well, the cynicism. I spent my life in academia, and I've seen the dark side of academia as well. I think the business world, there's a dark side to the business world. We can become cynical, but we cannot. It's not a positive way to approach life. I experienced an unstable mixture of cynicism and idealism as a young man half a
Hmm.
century ago. And but we can't stay there because it will cripple our ability to serve God and our fellow human beings. That we cannot be mired in cynicism. We have to pick ourselves out of that, with the help of God through the ministry of the Holy Spirit, and to minister to our neighbors in the best way that we possibly can.
Now, David, you just made a great point. Is you were stuck in that? How did you get out of it? Was this something that happened? How did you mentally reframe your mind and change your way of thinking? Then,
Uh, it wasn't any particular event. I think it's just a recognition, as I aged, as I became more mature, that life, everyone, we're all sinners. I'm a sinner. It's not just that Richard Nixon or the people who started the Watergate scandal were sinners, but we're all sinners. We're all, um, our churches are filled with hypocrites. Some people will say, well, I don't want to go to church because it's filled with hypocrites. I think the proper answer to that is, well, there's always room for one more hypocrite, and that I myself should come to the foot of the throne of grace, because we're all hypocrites, we're all sinners, we all have are broken and need the saving grace of Jesus Christ.
yeah. One of the things I would love our young leaders who are listening on this cohort in different parts of the world is to hear your journey as well too. They may be sitting there, they just don't want to deal with politics. Hey, look, it's all
Yeah,
bad. I'm going to avoid all of those things. I'm going to stay in my bubble. You're going to have to get engage it. But then at the same time, you could be cynical all you want, but you got to change your frame of thinking, or you're just going to live a miserable life.
that's right. Yeah, and as a matter of fact, when I was writing this book, when I started writing it, um, I found myself writing it in a way that I had not intended. You may have heard that there are some authors of fiction who create a character, but then the character
Yeah.
becomes so fleshed out and real in their minds that the character runs away with the plot. And I found something very
Mm.
similar in this book, Citizenship Without Illusions. I found myself more than I had intended focusing on the local level, because the
Mm-hmm.
local level, not so much on the national level or the provincial or state level, but I found myself focusing more on the local level, because the local level is where you are far more likely to be able to make an impact, for the kingdom of God, for the benefit of your neighbors. On the national level, it may be that in many respects we are so focused through the media, now through social media, on the national level, that it deflects us from the flesh and blood communities in which we are embedded. Family, neighborhood, the communities of which we are a part, our church communities as well. And the online communities that we create around ourselves, they are not by any means an adequate substitute for the flesh and blood communities which have shaped us and to which we owe a debt of gratitude.
Wow, very, very good. David, when you first originally wrote the book, I know you went with University Press. They work a lot on college universities. What's your intention to engage some of the younger people? And even what's the response? Has it been more of the older baby boomers, Gen X, and all that stuff, or has it been more of the younger ones that you've been engaging with?
Well, honestly, I think it's the younger ones, and that's my primary ministry. I have found since my retirement, I have been mentoring several young people, and it wasn't my intention. I didn't see this as being part of my ministry, but I have seen the way that God has guided my ministry, and I do think of it as an academic ministry. Over the last, now it's almost 9 years since I retired, and it's and I have found myself coming into contact with and spending time with young people. Not in a how should we say? It's not as though I have set up a particular curriculum, but just being there with them and talking with them and sharing with them and really coming to love them. And there was about I guess it's about 2018, I think was the year I discovered that there was a young man who found living in the Netherlands, who acquired the first edition of Political Visions and Illusions from a Dutch theologian who was downsizing at the time that he retired, saw my name, saw that I was teaching in Canada, and decided that God was leading him to come to Canada to study
Mm,
at the university where I had taught for 30 years, not
wow.
knowing that I was no longer teaching there. So he came, he started studying, and my last students told me, there's a young man who came here because he thought you were teaching there. So I connected with him, and so for the next couple of years, right up until the pandemic, um, you know, changed
Yeah.
the whole way the teaching was taking place. For the next couple of years, we would meet every 3 weeks, and we bonded, an intense emotional bond. I just love the young man. He's actually very well connected in the Netherlands. He's only in his mid-20s, but he was able to find the former leader of a Dutch political party to endorse this most recent book of mine.
Wonderful.
So
Wonderful.
yeah, so I have found that there's a real strong relational element to my ministry that I have just um, that I find extremely rewarding in what I'm doing right now.
And David, as a follow up, with a lot of the young people that you're mentoring, do you find many of them are theologians, pastors, seminarians, or is it
Yeah.
those who want to go in politics, or even general people who are just in the marketplace trying to figure out what to do?
Mostly political science. There is a young man that I'm spending time with. I'm going to be meeting with him on Wednesday of this week. This is the beginning of January, and his parents are members of my church congregation downtown. When he was going to university, he was 18 years old. His parents told me that he was going to study political science, so I made a beeline for him, and I said, if you want, I'm willing to meet with you on a regular basis just to talk things through. We ended up meeting about once every month. It became clear to me that he wasn't going to be going into political science, that he was going to go into the church ministry. And so I asked him, well, do you want to keep meeting? And he said, oh yes, yes, let's keep doing that. And after a couple of years, we had become such good friends that we couldn't imagine not getting together and meeting with each other. So
Yeah,
it's each of these relationships works out quite differently, but
yeah.
they're all just precious to me, and I just love connecting with the young people.
And one word of advice and encouragement for these people, David, what would you say to those individuals who are working in things like Accenture, Bain, family businesses, they're engineers and all that stuff, who are teachers or medical doctors? What would your encouragement be as they read this book and engage with this book to really be able to look at their city?
Yeah, just be spiritually discerning about the kinds of spirits that are afoot within the various areas of life. So I deal in my writings with the spirits within political life, but you're going to find these everywhere you go. It's not just limited to politics. If you get into the corporate world, even if you're talking about starting a small business, if you're talking about the marketplace, how are we responsible consumers? Shopping malls now, people are shopping online. What are we gaining and what are we losing by buying things online? When we're not connecting with people, with flesh and blood people around us. Those are the kinds of things that we need to think about. Social media as well. The it's um, uh, that's an arena where we need to be on guard for the spirits that are abroad within social media.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. David, one question for me that I've always struggled with is I grew up in the age where Democrats, Republicans would at least sit there and work with each other and talk, and there was moderates, and there was debate, and there was discussion. These days, you look at a world where it's heavily Republican on one side, heavily Democrat on one side. Everyone's just sitting there shooting arrows at each other. How do you operate? How do you still become a good Christian, but still love and understand what does it mean to be a good citizen today in the U.S.?
Yeah, yeah. I think what we need to do is to hang on to each other, and to be open to discussing with people with whom we may not be in agreement.
Yeah.
And that's a tall order these days. I don't think it was so much when I was growing up, but I've lived outside of the United States, as I said, for about 40 years now, and it doesn't look like the same country that I left behind, and I don't
Mm-mm,
like what I
mm-mm.
see, to be honest.
No.
There were always people in politics, Christian people whom I highly respected. One of these was Mark O. Hatfield, who
Yeah.
was governor of Oregon, and then he was senator from Oregon. He was in politics for half a century between 1946 and 1996. And I saw him in person speaking at a church in Minneapolis about half a century ago. And I had huge respect for the man. There were other people, Christians in political life. Stephen Monsma, who was a professor at Calvin College, now Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He was in the Michigan State Legislature. Paul Henry, who is represented the Grand Rapids district in the U.S. House of Representatives. Senator Paul Simon from
Paul
Illinois.
Simon. Yes.
In
Yeah.
my home state of Illinois, a devout Lutheran Christian, and there were always, and unfortunately, over the last quarter of a century, I can't think of a single person in the United States Congress who claims to be a Christian that I have respect for. Things have become so toxic. Things have become so poisonous, and I find that very discouraging.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Oh man, no, thank you very much, David. And also, then, as a Christian, then, when you say, how then do you learn how to have disagreements, conversations? Because some people will say, well, I'm standing up for my rights. I have to be committed to my rights. Is
Yeah.
it just purely listening and honoring the voices that you're hearing and disagreeing with?
I think we need to do more listening than talking, to be honest.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, that's a tall order, especially within the political realm. Now, it may be different on local levels, and I know that local politics is different. Americans are famously attached to their local political communities, and I think that's still the case. At least I hope that is. But I think we need to be willing to listen to each other, and not so much talk. and
Yeah.
and we should sit around tables rather than across barricades.
Wonderful. David, one fun question. How did your music, I'm seeing music in the back of your background. How did your love of music and your education, your music, your background music prepare you for what you're doing now?
It's a bit of a sideline, admittedly. I love the Psalms. For since I was a young man, I have prayed the daily office, which I discovered from a book that was titled "The Daily Office," published by Concordia Publishers, the Lutheran publisher in St. Louis, Missouri. I have prayed the daily office, and the daily office. This goes back to the Benedictine monasteries. It goes back to to ancient Jewish practice, even prior to the Christian era, of praying through the Psalms on a regular basis. In the monasteries, they prayed through the Psalms every week. In the Book of Common Prayer, there's a pattern for praying through the Psalms on a monthly basis, and that's the one that have followed for almost 50 years now. And of course the Psalms were meant to be sung as well. So one of my projects was to set the Psalms to verse so that they could be sung to the melodies of the 16th century Genevan Psalter, and I started that project back in 1985. I finally finished it in 2021,
Wonderful.
and so I'm searching for a publisher to publish this collection. It's not going to be a great seller, I think, but it's this has been a labor of love, and I've been working on this. I just um, finished a guitar journey through the Psalms. You can find that on my YouTube channel. All 124 of the Genevan Psalter melodies I've now performed on the guitar, recorded them, and put them on my YouTube channel.
Wonderful. Well, speaking of your YouTube channel, are you on social media? And what is your YouTube channel?
Yeah, it's called it's the @ Byzantine Calvinist, and my blog is called Notes from a Byzantine Rite Calvinist. This is a reference to my father's background in the Greek Orthodox Church on the island of Cyprus. And so, yeah, it's a tongue-in-cheek moniker that I came up with probably about 30 years ago. I have had a blog with this name for more than 25 years, well, almost 25 years now. So and that's where you're most likely to find me.
Wonderful, wonderful. David, thank you so much for just the time that you took. Thank you for the discussion. Are you speaking very much these days in person, or is it mostly through virtual?
Yeah, I have spoken in person. I will be at Calvin University in Grand Rapids in March. At the end of this month, I will be at a Christian university in Kentucky as well. So I have done some traveling,
Yeah,
but most of my speaking has been online.
yeah, yeah. Will we see you in Chicago back anytime soon, David?
Not anytime soon, but perhaps at some point we'll be back there.
You got it. David, thank you so much for making time today.
You're very welcome.
All right. Talk soon.